Thank you for joining us for the East Mediterranean Business Culture Alliance's, EMBCA's, webinar entitled Shockwaves Across the Eastern Mediterranean, Business Risks and Strategic Implications. My name is Lou Katsos, the president of EMBCA, and it is my pleasure to welcome you. Today's discussion will be moderated by Johnny Katsos, visiting professor at the Kelley School of Business at Indiana University and a Nobel Peace Prize nominee. We are joined by a distinguished panel: Scott Wilcox, founder and CEO of Sicuro Group; Laury, Haytayan, MENA, director of the Natural Resources Governance Institute; and Jay Joseph, director of the Business and Conflict Research Group and assistant professor at the American University of Beirut. In the weeks following Israeli and American strikes on Iran and Tehran's subsequent response, the East Mediterranean has entered a period of sustained tension that is now directly impacting business operations across the region. What began as a military escalation has evolved into a broader geopolitical and economic disruption. For companies operating in the East Mediterranean, the risks are no longer theoretical, they are immediate and operational. Instability in Lebanon continues to strain fragile institutions and heighten regional uncertainty. Maritime corridors linking the Levant, the Suez Canal, and European markets are operating on increased military coordination, complicating shipping and logistics. Energy markets remain volatile, with renewed concern over offshore infrastructure, pipeline development, and regional cooperation. At the same time, global supply chains moving through key regional ports, from Haifa to Piraeus, are under growing pressure, forcing firms to reassess routing, risk exposure, and investment strategy. The maritime sector, particularly Greek shipping, is again, adapting in real time, adjusting routes, insurance structure, and chartering decisions as war risk premiums rise and security conditions evolve. Today's panel brings together leading experts to examine both the immediate operational challenges and the broader strategic implications for trade, energy, and investment across the Eastern Mediterranean. At the moment, when this region once again sits at the crossroads of great power rivalry, regional conflict, and global commerce, understanding these dynamics is not optional, it is essential. It is now my pleasure to further introduce our moderator, Johnny Katsos. John is a globally recognized expert in crisis management, business resilience, and operating under extreme pressure. He serves as visiting professor at the Kelley School of Business at Indiana University and as professor of the American University of Sharjah. His thinking has shaped how organizations approach resilience at the highest levels. Over nearly 2 decades, he has conducted more than 1,000 interviews with executives and leaders across active conflict zones, including Syria, Ukraine, Iraq, Colombia, and Sri Lanka, offering a rare ground-level perspective and decision-making under extreme conditions. Dr. Katsos has been featured in leading global publications, including the Financial Times, the Harvard Business Review, and the Washington Post. And he regularly advises senior executives and policymakers navigating geopolitical disruption, reputational risk, and institutional volatility. Dr. Katsos, the floor is yours.
Thanks so much, Lou. And good afternoon, everybody, and welcome. I'm John Katsos. On most days, I'm a researcher who studies what happens to business when the world stops making sense. And today is one of those days. So 29 days ago, the US and Israel launched coordinated strikes on Iran, and the operation killed much of the leadership of the regime, targeted nuclear sites, and set off the largest cascade of retaliatory missile and drone strikes that the Middle East has seen in modern history. Iran struck back across 9 countries. It closed the Strait of Hormuz, through which roughly 1/5 of the world's oil passes. And because of the vast number of industries that are likely to be economically impacted by the closure, many commentators are calling this the everything shock. The headlines have focused understandably on the military and the energy dimensions. Today, our panel is going to ask a very different question, or try to answer a different question. What does this mean for the firms, the investors, energy developers, business leaders who have exposure and are operating in and around the Eastern Mediterranean. So we've got an exceptional panel to work through these questions. Again, our goal today is not to predict how the conflict ends. Instead, it's about trying to help leaders with Eastern Med exposure to think clearly about what they're actually facing and what decisions need to be made now. So let me introduce our panelists. So first, Scott Wilcox is the founder and senior advisor at Sicuro Group, which is a global risk management firm headquartered in Dubai. Scott and Sicuro have been assisting companies and stakeholder governments with pragmatic solutions and advice to maintain operations, temporarily depart where necessary, and understand and take proactive steps to counter any second and third order effects. Thank you, Scott, for joining us.
Thank you.
Laury Haytayan is the MENA director at the Natural Resource Governance Institute, or NRGI, where she leads the Institute's energy governance and geopolitics portfolio across the Middle East and North Africa. She's also a leading voice on Eastern Mediterranean energy dynamics and hosts NRGI's webcasts on energy transition in the region and holds a graduate degree from the University of Exeter. Welcome, Laury. And Dr. Jay Joseph is director of the Business and Conflict Research Group, or BICAR, and assistant professor of business and peace at the American University of Beirut Suleiman S. Olean School of Business. His research focuses on the role of companies in conflict-affected regions, including entrepreneurship, peace building, and livelihood development. He's worked with a range of UN agencies and international NGOs to support business-based livelihood programs in conflict zones, and also supporting business practices that reduce conflict and advance peace. Welcome, Jay.
Thanks, John. It's great to be here. And hi, everyone.
So what I want to do is start with an opening round of questions and ask for each panelist to take about 5 minutes to respond. Scott, I want to start with you. So you advise all sorts of people, governments, multinationals, family offices that are operating in exactly these kinds of environments, right? And you've been doing it for a long time. We're now 4 weeks into the current war. What are the most immediate operational risks for clients with Eastern Med exposure that they're dealing with right now? And what are they asking you that they weren't asking a month ago?
Sure. Thanks, John. So it's a really good point that the part about Eastern Med is the majority of preparation for and within the resilience structure was focused around proximity to Iran and the Gulf. And so that was all first order. And whilst there's always been a very close eye on Lebanon, as an example, that I think was underestimated just how much exposure and impact that organizations had, particularly from a commercial perspective. When we drill down what is, again, arguably a second order effect, we're actually seeing that the interdependency or mutual dependency on Lebanon for human capital in particular, it makes up the backbone of the educated workforce that spans finance, medicine, law, engineering throughout the region. And so that, again, in itself creates a big exposure for those Gulf companies. Where do they relocate temporarily this workforce to? And those with an extended duty of care, how do they support the employees and their dependents that are back home in Lebanon? And that was everything from, giving advice for shelter in place or temporary locations in country to understanding and preparing for communications and power outages so that remittances could be made. So deliveries of things like cash, and understanding, again, how long that could go on for and what that could look like, all the way through to the, again, temporary departure with the restrictions on the airport and there being no good options for maritime, having to look at going across the northern border into Syria and down into Jordan. And then if we extrapolate that, it's, well, how long do we take these people that would like to depart out, and under what auspices do they come back? What will a normal look like for those dependents or that workforce to return? And so I think the open-ended part on that as a first trigger is, where can we take our Lebanese workforce to? Cairo has been a relatively stable option, although it takes time to apply for visas to bring Lebanese nationals into, but they form a critical role in the continuity, and like I said, the backbone of business through the region. And so they're the first group that we're receiving the biggest inquiries for, again, duty of care and continuity. The second is a more surprising one, which hasn't focused so much in operational resilience, which is if we have to remove our Greek and Cypriot families from the Gulf back to their home of record for a sustained period of time, and now we're at 30 days and counting, what are the tax implications for those families? Because now the kids are going to be re-enrolled back into school at home of record. These are married, accompanied families. And so the questions we're being asked is, how safe, or when will it be safe for those families to return back to the Gulf countries because of the tax exposure, both at the individual level, and if you have a concentration risk of managers or senior executives from one nation that then relocates back home or goes home, there's actually an organizational or a corporate tax exposure that has to be reviewed. So again, looking at this as a cost risk analysis, many eyes are on the Gulf as to what an acceptable risk level or tolerance will be for those moving back. And again, what they can do to both mitigate and manage and support those returning expatriates back home for a period of time. Yeah, those are the biggest ones.
Great, thanks, Scott. What I want to do is now move to Jay. So we have this sort of we're moving up in stages, right? So from Scott, we've got a nice sense of almost the individual level. Jay, you're at the American University of Beirut, you direct BICAR, and Lebanon and the regions, Lebanon in particular, that was living through what might be the fourth or fifth overlapping crisis that it was facing simultaneously. And Scott started us off with a conversation about Lebanon being sort of the crux. And you research a lot of how firms actually behave in conflict settings beyond just Lebanon. I wonder what you're seeing in terms of companies in Lebanon, but also in the broader Eastern Med, about how they're trying to stay viable in terms of the business itself.
Yeah, thanks, John. And I think Scott raised some really interesting points. I think I'll begin by saying that, Lebanon, as you mentioned, has gone through multiple crises, particularly in the last 6 to 7 years. The most recent war that occurred with Israel was October to end of November 2024. And in Lebanon, we're used to conflict across the border and low levels of civil conflict in the country. But I think what I'll say is that although the Lebanese business environment is used to local instability, things this time are very different. The intensity of the conflict and the humanitarian implications that have occurred in recent weeks is on a scale which hasn't occurred before. The rules of the conflict are very different this time around. As many of you will know, Lebanon is largely a sectarian state, to which different sects live in different parts of the country, largely. And even towards the capital, Beirut is broken into different segments. And these geographical boundaries used to widely define the conflict that we'd experience in the country. This time, it's very different. It appears that those geographical lines or boundaries have been blurred. The rate of displacement is significant, now upward of 1 million in the country, which is about 20% of Lebanon's population. What's different this time around also is that the usual safe havens, which would be the UAE and the Gulf countries for Lebanese businesses, is now off limits because of the scope and the scale of the conflict. And Lebanon, like many countries in the Levant, including Syria and Iraq, is deeply connected to the regional politics that takes place. And so I think it's fair to say that this time around, the rules of the game are very different, and it has significant implications for businesses in Lebanon or who are connected to Lebanon. So exit, pivot, and actually entry decisions will be facing many businesses. foreign multinationals are obviously facing exit choices at the moment, and businesses with a relatively light infrastructure footprint in the country are facing these same decisions at this point in time. As Scott mentioned, the business environment relies in the region relies on Lebanese labor, but has also taken advantage of a 2019 financial crisis that occurred in the country, which basically saw the drop of basically the wiping out of the middle class in Lebanon. Average salaries dropped from 3,000 to 4,000 a month down to 1,000, 1,500 a month, and many companies in the region have taken advantage of that and set up offices in Lebanon. Now these satellite outposts of companies in the Gulf or in the broader region are now facing an exit issue similar to the multinationals that are operating in the country. And so many businesses will have to pivot, but as I said, it's different this time around, whereby through the multiple crises that have happened over the last 6 years, that pivot would often be to the UAE or to the Saudi Arabia or to other more stable countries in the region. But now this is off limit. What we're looking at in terms of the conflict and what's coming up next, really no one knows what's coming. Like I mentioned, the rules of the game are different this time around, and there's not really a blueprint for how to manage for businesses to manage what's coming up next. And it's largely going to depend on the political outcome of the conflict at hand. In Lebanon and in the Levant more broadly, the distinct political conflict between the US-backed sides, which we have a government at the moment which receives strong US support, as does the Syrian government, which is now in control. If this side ends up prevailing, then we'll see a shift in the corporate political dynamics that occur in Lebanon and across the region, and those aligned businesses will grow stronger. But if things remain undetermined, if there is no clear outcome from this, what we're facing in Lebanon, which will extend to Syria and Iraq as well, is that a likely growing of the sub-state political business groups which exist and operate largely across the region now. So it's quite it's a complicated situation that we're facing, and that the business environment is facing. Like I said, there's exit and pivot decisions which businesses now have to grapple with. But if things continue to destabilize and there's growth of informality or sub-state actors which control large parts of the business environment in our region, it's going to provide further barriers for companies from outside, multinationals or regional businesses. Is going to provide increasing levels of difficulty and complications for entry into Lebanon and the region as a whole. Yeah.
Yeah, thanks for that, Jay. Laury, I want to shift to you. So the Eastern Med energy picture, in some ways, over the last decade has been sort of optimistic, right? So Cyprus, Israel, Egypt, and Greece have been building out these offshore gas infrastructure. There's been regional cooperation frameworks that have been deepening. But now we've got gas benchmarks doubling. The Hormuz crisis is exposing how thin European gas storage has been. And Iran's gas flows to Turkey have been interrupted since the South Pars strike. How durable do you think these East Med cooperation frameworks are now? And is this a moment that you think is going to fundamentally reshape the energy architecture for the region?
Yeah, thank you, John, for the question and for inviting me to speak about that. So basically, just to remind everyone about what is the East Med gas story. So basically, it had started even before 2011, and I'll tell you why 2011. It was mainly a story of Egypt providing gas to Israel, and that was the story. And basically, after 2011 and the revolution and uprising, the Arab Spring, and then Egypt stopped providing gas to Israel. But it happened that in 2013, Israel started producing gas from the Tamar field. And since then, the balance had changed. And then Egypt had became, even though it's the biggest producer still of gas, but it consumes more than it produces. And in a couple of years ago, they have declining gas production. So they're more and more relying on Israeli gas. So basically, Israel, which is the second biggest producer in the Eastern Mediterranean, does have gas for its own consumption and for exporting. So it became the center of exporting to the two countries where it has peace with, which is Jordan and Egypt relying mainly on Israel for its the closest neighbor and importing from Israel with good rates. So basically what we are seeing today, it's like Lebanon was unlucky twice, couldn't find gas. Cyprus has potentials, but it was never commercially viable. And even today, we're still seeing that even with what you mentioned about like the Strait of Hormuz closing, the LNG that is like stuck in the Qatari LNG that is stuck, looking at potentials for Europe and other markets like where the gas is, even that is like not pushing the companies and the governments, especially in Cyprus, like to move forward with the new developments. We've heard like a couple of days ago that still companies are in disagreement with the Cypriot government over like starting the production. So basically, and then you have the new kid on the block, Syria. So that was like, it has potential. Chevron had signed a deal with Syria, yet to understand what's the nature of it and but like at least Chevron is one of the biggest companies that is in the Eastern Mediterranean, same as Chevron is in Cyprus, and Chevron is in Israel, and Chevron has presence in Egypt. So Chevron is becoming the main player for the East Med gas. But as you said, stability. What about stability and the impact of all of this war? So just to say, like that was like just a background to say that where the collaboration and cooperation between governments and companies has been is where there was already peace between countries. So, and that's the trio that we were talking about, which is like Egypt, Israel, and Jordan, where they have this collaboration. And even when we had the highest of the crises between Egypt and Israel over what was happening in Gaza, we saw Egypt and Israel signing one of the biggest deals for the Israeli gas fields, mainly for Leviathan. So, and then definitely what we are seeing as well is like Egypt is the core to become the hub because it has the infrastructure. So even all the gas that is going to be produced one day from Cyprus, it's all linked to the Egyptian infrastructure. So it's all about the terminals that exist there. So all you need now is like this crisis that is happening in Hormuz and in the Gulf to push the companies and the governments, especially like in Cyprus, to be more proactively coming to an agreement so that these projects come to life. And we're talking like 5 to 6 years, but then it will be something that will be good for the Egyptians and it could be good for the markets. Where it's not working, basically, it's when there is no peace, because you were talking about stability and collaboration in the East Med, so that it could play an important role. So, for instance, like the idea that the American administrations had, it's like where there is no peace, we bring the energy component to bring stability. So they thought that it could work. And then this is what they tried. They said like, okay, now we deal with non-state actors. And this is before 7 October. We deal with non-state actors. We think that non-state actors like Hezbollah and Hamas, they're very rational and they're thinking like state actors. So we're fine with them. So let's bring them into this issue of like gas incentives, etc. They managed in Lebanon to sign a maritime deal between Israel and Lebanon in 2022 in the hopes that this will create incentives for companies to come and start working and hopefully to find gas in Lebanon, and it will stabilize the borders. 8 October comes, and it shows that this model doesn't work. Same for Gaza as well, because in Gaza, after they signed the maritime deal between Lebanon and Israel, they thought that, okay, so let's give the go-ahead and the green light for Gaza Marine to be developed with the support of the Qataris, with the support of the Egyptians, with the support of the Palestinian Investment Authority. Let's do that and then bring Hamas into this regional energy hub. 7 October happens. Again, it shows that it doesn't work. The prerequisite for stability, prerequisite for energy collaboration in the region would be to be able to have an agreement, which is like a political agreement, or want to call it a peace agreement, but some sort of a strong agreement rather than just an ad hoc energy agreement. It needs a political agreement so that you get into the energy collaboration for the region. So that is what we basically are seeing in the East Med. So it has potential, but as well, like the risks are high. And what we've seen today is like the announcement of Eni, the Italian company, saying that it's becoming too complex, too risky for us to invest in Israel. And they decided to leave one of the consortium that they had 2 years ago. And they said, we're not going to continue with our consortium with Dana Petroleum and another Israeli company. They said, that's too complicated for us. So that's one issue that we are going to face as well if there is no real setup that would lead to more peaceful neighborhood. You will continue, you might end up seeing companies that are not that keen on working in the Eastern Mediterranean. And the last word that I would say is is that there are many disagreements. Like even Syria, with all the potential, it has to solve its maritime borders with Cyprus. Then you have the issue with the Greek Cypriots and the Turkish Cypriots. How is Turkey going to react to that? They have to deal with the border issues, maritime border issues with Lebanon. So there are many issues, political issues, that would prevent, like really for the Eastern Mediterranean to become a hub, real hub, where there is a lot of gas coming to be able to add to what the market needs. So, and this is what we're seeing. So at this stage, like it is a mixed, if you want, a mixed outlook, because like it's positive and negative, because like if the situation stays as it is today, so you will continue having more collaboration between Egypt and Israel and Jordan and Cyprus, and Lebanon will be isolated kind of. And as Jay said, but again, because we don't know what's the future of the region is going to be. Before the war, before like Hezbollah gets Lebanon into this war, the Lebanese government had agreed and had at least announced their willingness to be part of the IMEC, the India, Middle East, and Europe corridor. And that's a big deal, because that's the biggest project for connectivity that is like supported by the Americans. So, and that's the project that everyone was thinking that's the project that will push the region to more connectivity, etc., even before 7 October, and then today with the war with Iran. So it is important to understand how this war is going to end and what is going to happen to the Iranian regime, to be able to know what's going to happen to the oil and gas industry in the Gulf, how they're going to overcome this huge problem with Hormuz, the Strait of Hormuz, and what could be the future of gas for the Eastern Mediterranean. And I'll stop here.
Great. Thank you so much, Laury. I wonder if we can shift now to sort of more open conversations about a couple of themes. The first one I want to talk about is about supply chains. And I'll start this question off with Scott, but then leave it up to everyone to be able to chime in after Scott gives his first response. So we've seen everything from airspace closures and thousands of flight cancellations to maritime rerouting. Time and cost have been added to container flows globally as a result of all of this. We have some ships that are trapped effectively in the Gulf, either waiting to unload or waiting to unload. manufacturers and retailers and distributors with regional exposure already have a cost problem. At what point do you see firms making structural changes to logistics that are not temporary anymore, right? So that are
Right.
stop being just sort of intermediate steps, but start being more permanent changes?
Yeah, I think they already have. This was driven largely by the insurance markets as well. If insurance isn't in place, ships can't travel, and that has a knock-on or flow-down effect immediately. And whilst you can always wait for something to change, that is the death knell of resilience. You must adapt to the situation you're in and the trajectory or the path that it's going, as opposed to hoping that it will return to normal and your extant plan will be relevant again. And so the smarter companies have moved with this. There's a lot of baked-in resilience throughout the region because these aren't the first closures that we've seen over the last 5-6 years or in recent times. And a lot was learned during COVID, during understanding what happens to supply chain resilience. But of course, nobody planned for so many regional countries to be impacted in myriad ways at the same time. But my personal view is that both private and public sector are handling this extremely well, and that they are operating again in consultation with each other. I could speak more to the Gulf than I could to Near East, but there is. You look at the airspace as to where one closes and the other takes up, with regard to, say, Oman and the UAE's airspace, and the same with Kuwait and Saudi, how they've worked together, and utilizing the other coast, i.e., the Indian Ocean coast, for supply. And that baked-in resilience has been there for a long time. Now it's just being tested, and like I said, I think it's been handled well. Time will tell, and I hope to see that companies will continue to, like I say, evolve to the operating reality of today.
So I'd leave it open to Jay or Laury if you want to respond to that or add anything.
Yeah, I guess I can speak just a little bit to companies in Lebanon and connected regions in the Levant. I think as Scott mentioned, I mean, COVID encouraged a lot of businesses to pivot. In Lebanon, for example, many companies began to relocate either their head offices or most of their financial centers offshore somewhere. Companies were further encouraged to do this in the 2024 conflict with Israel. And especially for us in Lebanon, the 2024 conflict forced many companies to establish backup plans because there was always going to be a high likelihood that conflict would come back. The problem for many businesses now is that their plan B was basically in the Gulf. And so throughout the last 5 to 6 years, many companies in the region have been encouraged to move further west, whether that be Turkey or into Europe, either to set up additional sales chains or supply chains, which are more secure than those directly in our region. But I think it will be the long-term effects of this will be case by case. Unlike the Gulf, businesses which are established in Lebanon, Syria, and Iraq operate under completely different circumstances. We have very weak institutions. The rule of law is applied differently to different businesses and to different groups. And so some businesses now, in terms of their supply chains or their customer chains, will be significantly under threat, while others will be able to weather the storm based on the depth of their plan Bs and how far west those extend.
Laury, I don't know if you wanted to add anything. No, okay. I wanted to shift a little bit then to just investment and capital flows. So Jay's already talked about this a bit, and Scott sort of briefly touched on it. This idea that a lot of the Gulf sovereign wealth funds and investors have been the major investors in the Eastern Mediterranean now for at least the last decade. Now they're dealing with their own incidents at home, right? Does this mean that the consideration of continued commitments or even new commitments in the region, whether it's in infrastructure, energy, or real estate or financial services, is going to be permanently impacted? Or is this just a sort of a temporary thread? And I leave that open to whoever wants to answer first.
So I can make some quick comments for the Levant out in our region. I think that this presents a significant risk, not only for capital inflows, but also the inflow of humanitarian aid. So typically, when Lebanon or Syria in most recent years would go through shocks or turmoil, it would be the Gulf countries who would come to their aid, supported by large international donors on the humanitarian front. But as you mentioned, John, now the Gulf countries are caught up in this directly, which is affecting not only state pockets, but also the private sector writ large. While at the same time, international institutions have been significantly weakened by changing postures of the US. For Lebanon in particular, but as I said, this also extends across the Levant. This is potentially catastrophic because the parachute that used to be there to prop up our part of the world when disaster would happen has dissipated significantly, and the risks increase of this further reducing every day that this conflict goes on.
Yeah, if you allow me as well, a couple of points, John. I think on that point, it's very important to understand like what will be the priorities of the Gulf countries and their sovereign wealth fund in the coming years, again, depending on what sort of an agreement they will get from the end of the war. That's very important. That's because today it's an open-ended question. We don't know. We don't know. It could be that President Trump can decide in 24 hours that this is going to end, and without any, if you want, a plan of what happens to Iran and how Iran is going to continue reacting or acting with its neighbors. Because I think we all had analysis saying that yes, Hormuz is one scenario where Iran would be closing the strait. We said that it might be for days, maybe weeks, thinking of 2 weeks maybe, and then it will be opened up. So now we're at 4 weeks and going on. And it's becoming the main card in the hands of the Iranians to go to negotiations with the Americans. So it's becoming the main issue more than the ballistics or nuclear, etc. At the same time, I'm not sure that I had read analysis saying that more than 80% of the attacks from the Iranians will be on the Gulf countries. That I'm not sure that I read in any of the scenarios or in anything that we were thinking. We used to say that these are potential retaliations that they would attack, but we never expected that 80% of the retaliation would be on the Gulf. So the Gulf now has to think about the new security setup that will come and where to put the money. So they have military spending. So we're asking, is it going to be military spending? Is it going to be more investment outside the region for oil and gas? Because the main business for these countries, even though they were spending a lot, especially UAE, Saudi Arabia, they were spending much on the transition, green transition, new technologies for energy, etc. But their main business still is oil and gas. Are they going to invest outside so that they would have that flexibility in case the Strait of Hormuz is one day again closed or something, so they have flexibility for the markets, and then there's no shock and where this is going to be. Already they do that. They invest a lot in the American market. So are they going to invest somewhere else? And this is where you come to the East Med. Qatar Energy is a silent partner in Lebanon, is a silent partner in Cyprus. Are they going to push for their contracts to really push and start like exploration, and hopefully like for Lebanon to find gas, for Cyprus to move on with some of the discoveries, so that they would have that diversification of the locations, the geography, to be able to cater for the markets in case they come up to the situation where they're in. And definitely Egypt has been one of the biggest recipients for the Gulf money for their economy. And that's why you don't see, it's not a surprise when you see that Egypt is one of the main partners trying to mediate and trying to negotiate a deal, because they would want to finish the war, because they do need to see again the Gulf money coming into Egypt. Is it going to be big as before or less? This is to be seen again, like what are the priorities. I don't think now, at least openly, the Gulf countries are talking about their next priorities, because now they're just defending themselves. But this is the discussion that I'm sure it's happening behind closed doors about, like, okay, we have this money, how to put the money in some place where we're safe and our business is safe. So that's, I think, like how they would be thinking in the future. So it will have an impact. This war has an impact on how they think and how they view the neighborhood.
Scott, you wanted to jump in?
Yeah, I just think, again, coming back to Lebanon specifically, whilst Gulf capital inflows are critically important, particularly for the reconstruction and maintenance of basic utilities of electricity, power, water. What's equally important and cannot be overlooked is the diaspora. There are something like 15 million. There are more working, or exponentially more working Lebanese outside Lebanon than there are in, and a big majority of those I go back to in the Gulf. There needs to be, again, unity between the Gulf countries and that Lebanese human capital to, again, we saw in 2016 when Hezbollah was identified or categorized as a terrorist organization, some Gulf member states expelled in quick order Lebanese people from their shores, and never to return. And what we don't want to see is a knee-jerk or an issue for Lebanese people getting visas, to work. It be that a slowdown in renewals, a longer process or whatever, because that will also have a catastrophic impact on the recruitment, retention, and the ability, like I said, for Lebanese nationals or citizens to rebuild their own country within the commercial sector.
That was great. I want to shift a little bit to the country we've only mentioned once, which is Turkey. So Turkey, to a certain extent, has this very exposed position because it imports 14% of its gas from Iran, which has now more or less been interrupted. It's drawing down on gold reserves at a rate that we haven't seen for about a decade to defend the lira. It's got a long-term gas contract with Iran that's going to expire soon. It's expiring this summer. It's also the only one of the countries in the Eastern Mediterranean with such a border with Iran itself. What does Turkey's predicament mean for the region, right? Not just in terms of energy, right, but sort of the broader security situation and how businesses interact with it, because it's such a critical part of the business infrastructure in the region. Again, I leave that to anybody who wants to start.
Let me say a quick thing about definitely on the gas issue. Definitely, Turkey has been for the past years trying to be as independent or as they can, and then that's why they were trying to. Because they do import like most of their needs and gas from abroad, from different sources. They're not relying as much on Iran, and they knew that there is a renew that will come, and they were not sure that if they want to renew, if they were able to get more Azeri gas, they would be more happier because they do have better relations with Azeris, and the Azeris are not going to be now under any sanctions. I don't see that happening. So it's more like it's secure for them, and then they do have their neighbors. So, and then even they were trying to see like what to do with different sort, but then to try to do some explorations on their own gas. So that's why. So they were happy when they had this Black Sea discovery, And they were really they were really keen on partnering up with companies that have the ability to extract the gas, and the same they were trying to do in the East Med. Now they're kind of relaxed on the East Med. Every time that they're doing okay with the Greeks, they relax in the East Med. Every time it's not going well, they do it. Even like with Egypt, when they're not happy with Egypt and Israel, like everything happens. The scene is the Eastern Mediterranean. Definitely, there were attempts for them to be able to find some gas in the Eastern Mediterranean as well, or at least support like the Turkish Greeks to find some. But I think we always said that if there were like more gas coming into the region, like basically the two big markets is Turkey and Egypt. So these are the two big markets. So there is possibility for the gas, if discovered in the Eastern Mediterranean, to be for the Eastern Mediterranean and not like to think much about Europe or other places, especially when we had all these acceleration and transition, and everyone was thinking more about like, okay, gas is a transition, but then we need to go into more renewables, into at least for electricity. And then we'll think about like hydrogen for industries, etc. All of that thinking, but it was always for the Eastern Mediterranean that the gas that will be found wherever, Lebanon, Syria, Turkey, Egypt, Israel, Cyprus, it's all like most of it, it's for the regional needs more than really exporting it. And I think like this is an opportunity, again, depending on what will happen with Iran. It could, if the outcome is that there is a change in the behavior of the regime, because now everyone's talking about changing the behavior of the Iranian regime and not changing the regime. So if there is a change and they're like thinking more about their economy and how to connect themselves to the region economically, because Iran is so rich. So if they really think about like how rich they are and they think about their economy, they will be a very powerful player, and they could join the IMEC, etc. And the Mediterranean itself could become really like a big economic space. So I'm not sure if the Iranians today are thinking about that, but that definitely it could be like whatever happens in Iran, that it will have an impact on Iraq, on Lebanon. Syria is, let's hope it's on the right track of really doing the right things for economic development. So I think Turkey and the rest, they can see the potential, and more cooperation could come, but it all depends what will happen in Tehran.
Jay or Scott, do you want to chime in about Turkey? No. Scott doesn't want to touch it.
It's a tough one to discuss, and it's a black box, which really there's not a lot of knowledge about it. I think one thing that's true though is that Turkey's position has been determined largely by the fact that it has feet in multiple camps. So you mentioned agreements with Iran, but also there's agreements. I'm not an energy expert, I won't say, but the Iraq-Turkey pipeline through northern Iraq is also in the interests of Turkey. They're supporting US initiatives in Syria, but they also don't want a migration inflow, similar to what happened after the Syrian civil war. So it's very difficult to talk about this issue and for pundits to estimate what is happening. But one thing is true, that they do have interests in multiple camps, and potentially from a business point of view, similar to Cairo, Istanbul could benefit in terms of general business movement from this conflict overall, and maybe it's a wait and see game for them to see how this plays out.
That's a perfect segue for Scott.
Yeah, I could talk to that bit just a little. So, Istanbul, yes, is a great hub for Eurasia. We've had clients look at Almaty to control their Central Asian operations because of the logistics all the way through to China. But Istanbul has been the more natural one. And let's not forget, again, I keep talking about these second and third order effects. Turkey, if nothing, is extremely opportunist. And if they see vacuums in African states where they've got interest, that are created by the focus of attention going elsewhere, they're very good at filling that gap. And we've seen that firsthand in terms of Turks again know how to do business, be it in terms of trade deals for defense, construction, and so on and so forth. We saw it in Mali, we've seen it in Libya and elsewhere. And so I think that's one to keep an eye on. But yeah, that's about it.
What's interesting is we've been talking about sort of the subtext of a lot of what we've been talking about is trying to predict out whether this will lead to kind of more cooperation or more nationalism in terms of defending companies, defending resources. And it sounds so far like everybody's leaning towards the idea that this will lead to actually more cooperation regionally rather than less. And I wonder if that's a fair assessment of everybody's feelings about this.
Yeah, notwithstanding healthy economic decision, you can't have an economy unless you have stability, as in a predictable economy that's investable and ready for capital inflow. And so you have to think bigger than the sum of your parts, so to speak. And I think the GCC is very good at that, at balancing those two. I think it will be a reckoning for particularly again Israel and Lebanon as to what coexistence looks like in terms of an economic future after whatever these objectives that are to be achieved are. And this is the kind of wait and see. I think it's going to be a tumultuous few weeks ahead, if not longer.
So I can make a quick comment on the back of that as well. I think Scott makes some really good points. But one thing we see across war zones is also true, is that you can have an economy without stability, but the nature of that economy changes. And so, John, the question you pose about whether cooperation would increase or nationalism would increase, I'm not sure we can draw clear conclusions on that. We know that supply chains and customer chains will definitely change as companies pivot. But if we're looking towards the future, and as we see with conflict trends more broadly, clear winners and losers of conflict is quite rare these days. Typically, what we have is conflicts which are increasing in terms of length. They tend to go on for longer, more actors are involved, and what that means, I would say, particularly for the Levant, is that it'll change the nature of the business activity that takes place. There'll be more informality. There'll be a deeper connection and expansion, probably, of the major businesses that are linked to political groups, and in a way, business and the control of commercial operations, ports, key resources, and infrastructure could, if this goes on long enough, become almost a battleground in itself. And so this is quite a scary prospect for our region, and one which would only result in the greater suffering of the people living where we are.
So in other words, if I hear what you're saying, it's that the private sector will no longer be private, right? That it won't sort of be on its own. It'll be submerged into the conflict dynamics of whichever location it's in.
Yeah, it's a fair comment. We already have elements of this at the moment to different degrees. But what tends to happen when conflict is extended is that the nature of that, the connection between politics and business gets deeper and deeper. Your normal business actors, your ethical business actors that function by the rule of law, who operate above board, tend to get squeezed out as monopolies take over different parts of the economy, and it becomes what many scholars now call a war ecosystem, or or a conflict-based private sector, where profiteers tend to do well and tend to do very well, and your run-of-the-mill legal legitimate businesses tend to get pushed out.
Anyone, Scott or Laury, anything to add?
Yeah, maybe just quickly to say about how like companies sometimes get involved into conflicts and they play a positive role. I think one example that we've seen was like in 2022 when the maritime border deal between Lebanon and Israel, and then at one point it became not a maritime deal. It was more about like it involved like hydrocarbons in it. So long story short, it's like at one point, Energean, which was working on the Israeli side, had kind of pushed the government to go ahead with the deal because the ship was on its way and they wanted to start with first gas and they couldn't delay anymore a deal. The same happened like when they brought on board again Total Energy, telling Total, look, once we have a deal, you have to come back to Lebanon and start drilling because this is part of the deal, or else we wouldn't have a deal. So that is like how companies played a positive role in solving that conflict. They pushed for or they facilitated a deal. Not to say that Lebanon benefited from it, at least, but that's just to say that this is one way as well, like how companies could be playing that a role in shaping the future economics of the region. And then I think one final word for me is like, again, taking these examples from very recent history. It's like when there was this attempt to sideline and not to look into conflicts in the region and just talk about economics, and then it blew up in everyone's face on 7 October. So again, it's important as well going forward not to ignore the conflicts, because there are no frozen conflicts, obviously. You think it's frozen and then suddenly it jumps into your face. So I think that could be one message as well for companies as well. They could play a role and not say that, no, these are like not our business. I think for the Eastern Mediterranean, companies could play a role. And same is like, because Scott and Jay were talking about Lebanon, just to give, I think like even like in Lebanon, the private sector, which is striving at, which was always the party that had saved the Lebanese economy when we had lack of government support, or like the government was really falling down. So this private sector has a say as well. They cannot say that we just do business and that's it. They do have to be part of the political structure that needs to be set up after this madness finishes in the Eastern Mediterranean and the Middle East in general. And that's my take on your question, John.
Thanks. That's great. I want to shift a little bit and then we'll start to wrap up. It seems like a humanitarian crisis is in the offing. And the last major one we had after the Syrian civil war caused a ton of pressure on the Eastern Mediterranean, right? So in Turkey and Lebanon, in Greece and Cyprus. The private sector played a role then. It seems like it will play a role now, whether it wants to or not, as an employer, as a logistics operator, as a source of hard currency, as a community actor. What role do you see the private sector playing in this kind of upcoming humanitarian fallout? Anyone who wants to start?
Yeah, so I can talk a little bit about what's happening in Lebanon. Although in Lebanon we have some businesses who you could class, they tend to be larger business, you could class them as profiteers, and they may not have an overall positive effect on the country as a whole. There's also a large number of incredible companies who because of the ongoing conflict and shocks that we've experienced in Lebanon, have made it part of their purpose to basically support the population, no matter what sect they're from, no matter what part of the country that they're from. And during every shock that we have, these companies really take up the reins and take it upon themselves to support those most in need. And And over the last couple of weeks, there's a lot of that activity happening at the ground level in Lebanon itself. So as to speak to the broader private sector, you know, the UN agencies are increasingly trying to attract funding from the private sector since country-based funding and multilateral funding is drying up. And really, in the case of Lebanon, we're hoping that companies, international companies I'm talking about, really step up to the plate because it's much needed.
I think off the back of that, you know, the point, well, one point is that the commercial sector is going to be under significantly more pressure than it would have been previously to be able to, you know, as and where it chooses to step up because of the lack of funding, as Jay said there. But you know, we take one step out and you look at the transition of USAID to State Department and its priorities for the region as to what it traditionally funded. And what it would or could fund, and at what speed in the future. I think that there is a potential for regional governments to make it somewhat easier for the commercial sector to participate in any form of national resilience or response through taxation and through some form of break. But you know, they're going to be doing this on the fly. One of the things that should be certainly sitting on the risk register at the moment is, you know, the exacerbation of natural disaster. If there's a natural disaster, and what triggered this conversation is the floods in the UAE and in the region right now, and what additional pressure that's put on. If that were to manifest in another way, such as, you know, quite regularly we have in Turkey, earthquakes, what kind of pressure would that then put on the ability to respond? So again, sadly not a positive, but certainly for more consideration.
So this has been great. I want to end with just, if I can get like a 60-second answer from each of you on this closing question, which is, if you just had to give this sort of the elevator pitch, one piece of concrete actionable guidance to a company with significant Eastern Med exposure, what would it be? And I'll start with Laury and then go to Jay and then go to Scott.
I guess I would say, like, you companies go help governments, like, to do like like in Lebanon, let's say, in Syria, like to really help them to make the pitch, like, for why they need to for companies to invest in it. I think, like, clarity in the political system, like in politics and where the country is going, like in Syria and Lebanon, let's say, because we're talking about these broken places. I think clarity on politics is very important for the investors to come and put their money, or else they wouldn't come for something that is not sustainable, that they will see it destroyed again and again.
Thanks. Jay?
I think the one thing I would say is settle in for the long haul. So I think something that in our part of the world we're very used to is having shocks, and for these shocks to come to an end relatively quickly. Most of the conflicts that we've experienced have been 20 days, 30 days, and then it comes to a distinct end. But I think the rules of the game have changed. This one might go for the long haul. There's a lot of hype and there's a lot of panic at this point in time, but this could go on. And so whatever that means for a business, whether it means pivoting different chains of the organization to different parts of the world, but it should be done under the expectation that there's a high likelihood that this level of instability could be something that turns into the new normal for the region.
And Scott, last word.
Yeah, sure. Again, pretty much Jay captured it there, but the advice to companies is to understand exactly what your critical exposure is to the region. Look at what those risks are and what you've transferred to your insurer, okay, so that, and be sure that you're updated on what their risk appetite is to catch you if you fall. And then again, if you are planning or you do feel that your risk appetite no longer matches the current risk in the region, define where and under what auspices you will go elsewhere, for how long, and what needs to change for you to then come back. And just be really deliberate about what you're doing, so that you don't jump out of the pan and into the fire.
Thank you. Thank you, Scott. Thank you, Laury. Thank you, Jay. And thanks to EMBCA and Katsos for hosting this conversation. What strikes me about the conversation is that this region has always been a place where geopolitics and commerce are relatively inseparable. So the line between energy, security, maritime sovereignty, state fragility, business strategy, they always kind of run directly through each other. And that was true in the era of the pharaohs. It was true for the Roman and Byzantine empires, true for the Ottoman empires, and it's true today. And it seems like firms will navigate this moment depending on what kind of advice they have. If it's the best advice from people like Scott and Laury and Jay, it will be better. If they have the clearest frameworks for decision-making under pressure, right? If they know how to do some of these things, again, from experts. And then what kind of relationships they have with governments, with communities, with partners that give them information and provide the resilience that is necessary when the headlines don't really keep up with the news that's coming on the ground. So thank you again to Scott, to Jay, to Laury, and to Lou and EMBCA for hosting this conversation. Hopefully this is the beginning of a conversation at the end. And thank you all for being here.
Yeah, thank you, everyone. And thank you, John, and to the panelists. This was a fascinating discussion. Obviously, what we're talking about are some of the more immediate and current challenges and broader strategic implications for trade, energy, and investment across the East Mediterranean. But please think about us getting together, hopefully in weeks, to discuss what happened, hopefully not in months. But I think we have to continue this discussion, because obviously something's going to come out of what's taking place right now. And I think we should regroup and have that discussion in the near future.